moment will appear the phone number that you can text questions to. I think we'll go for those questions first, but if they dry up, pop up your hands, and we have about 25 minutes to do the Q&A.
Fantastic.
Okay, so if you're asking a question, it'd probably be helpful if you just sort of stick your hand up, and when we give you the microphone, just say who you are, perhaps where you're from, which church or whatever, and ask your question. And Andy will then do his best to answer it. He doesn't promise to answer every question, but he's pretty good.
And if not, Matt, you can phone at 3 in the morning, so
yeah,
you know.
Yeah. Don't phone this number at 3 in the morning, otherwise you won't be on my Christmas card list. Okay, the first question here that I had was, do you have any tips for evangelizing and starting conversations? Well, I think Andy's probably answered that, but it might be worthwhile just reiterating your question slide, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you for whoever asked that question. So to reiterate those 3 questions that I taught in that first session, what do you mean by that? Why do you think that? But the last one, have you ever wondered? Because if you're trying to start a spiritual conversation with someone who has no interest, no perception of Christian things, no Christian background, sometimes leaping straight into, so, would you like to hear about Christianity? You could get a door slammed in your face because they don't have any framework for understanding what you're talking about. But if you start by something they're interested in, so when I'm looking for starting spiritual conversations, I'm always trying to find those things in my friend's life that they're obviously passionate about. I remember some years ago having a friend of mine who was quite disinterested in spiritual things. Every time I tried to, raise kind of sort of a God-type conversation, he would shut the door, said he wasn't interested. But then one day I noticed he had an Amnesty International sticker on the back of his car. And I remember saying to John, I said to him, just out of interest, why is that sticker there? And he talked about how he was passionate about human rights and injustice. And very similar to my friend in the school, I was able to say to him, well, okay, just out of interest, why do you think human life matters and is significant? I mean, after all, aren't we just another collection of atoms and particles? I mean, what makes human life different from a cockroach or a cow? You obviously think there's a difference. And he said, I do. And as we pursued that then became a God conversation. So my first comment would be, look for things that your friend is already interested in and start there. If you want a biblical model of this, by the way, go read Acts chapter 17, where Paul is in Athens. And Paul does this. He wanders around Athens. He sees the altar to the unknown God, and he starts a spiritual conversation of, hey, I saw this statue to an unknown God. Let me talk about that for a bit. So that's the first thing. And then second thing, I would just say, in that conversation, obviously what you want to do is not just talk theoretically about ideas. Look for ways to bring Jesus into that conversation. And one way you can do that is just look for opportunities to as the conversation with your friend progresses, look for opportunities to say, hey, something you've said there reminds me of something that Jesus said, or reminds me of something that Jesus did. I remember talking to somebody a few years ago who was very anti-Christian. I'd mentioned Christianity. They'd actually said, I hate Christianity, which is always a good start. And I'd asked why, and they talked about many of the perceptions of what perhaps the church and Christians had done negatively in history, some of which were unfair, some of which I thought were right on the money. But I let them have their rants. I asked a couple of questions to make sure I got it fully. And then I turned around to them, I said, so it sounds like you have a problem with people misusing religion for their own ends. I do, the man said. I said, that's really interesting, because that reminds me of Jesus. Because you do know, don't you, when Jesus was here on earth, he spent most of his time attacking the religious leaders for misusing religion. He went, really? I went, yes. And I actually had the opportunity to open up the Bible at that point and show one of the interactions with Jesus and the Pharisees. And it made this connection, because I think this guy had figured that Jesus was just totally pro-organized religion. And to realize that actually Jesus was a critique of bad religion was a starting point. And all I did was find the opportunity to say, hey, let's bring Jesus into this conversation. People are fascinated by Jesus, so look for ways to bring him in.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Just a suggestion perhaps for you. One of the things you might want to do when you go back to your church or whatever is do a little bit of role play or something like that. So somebody sort of plays an antagonist and asks an awkward question, and then you can think about how would I respond to that question, and maybe, work it out that way.
Excellent.
Get a little bit of practice
Yeah.
to do that kind of thing.
Brilliant advice.
Okay, the next question really is perhaps one that we would have perhaps looked at last night when we were talking about is God a good God when he allows suffering? Sadly, our question asker says that how can God be a God of love when he took my 14-year-old daughter? And I guess, many of us have got experience of losing a child or, someone within the family who's lost a child. So what would be your response to that?
Yeah, those are some of the hardest questions, actually, in some ways, aren't they? Because I think those are that's not just an intellectual question. There's also a pastoral, emotional angle to that. And I remember really first feeling the force of that myself when on the way to having our first child, we lost 3 children through miscarriages. And I know that's not quite the same as losing a 14-year-old, but I remember the grief of going through a failed pregnancy and another failed pregnancy and another failed pregnancy. I remember, sitting on the couch with my wife, sort of processing that. And the thought occurred to me that, gosh, upstairs in my study, I have dozens of books written by philosophers on the problem of evil. Probably bringing one of those down and sharing it with my wife is not the right response, because something deeper is needed. So let me say a couple of things. First thing I would say is, interestingly, the need we have, the desire we have to ask why, and why has this happened, that question itself actually, ironically, only makes sense if God exists. If we lived in a godless universe, then of course suffering is going to happen, and there's nothing wrong with it. There's no right, there's no wrong, there's no way the world is supposed to be. If we live in a godless universe, every one of us is going to die, some of us horribly. One day the human race will become extinct, one day the sun will expand and swallow the earth, and one day everything comes to an end. And there is no right, there's no wrong, there's no justice, there's no injustice. The very fact we feel the need to ask the why question, I think, shows that we recognize deep down that the world is not supposed to be that way, that death is wrong. It is an intrusion into God's good creation, which is just interesting straight away. Second thing I would say, particularly to a Christian who's struggling with this, but of course the other thing I noticed, and we noticed this when processing the miscarriage situation, was that if you throw God out the window, and it can be tempting to, I understand that, it can be tempting to go, what is going on? It doesn't actually help you with the suffering and the pain. You still have the suffering and the pain and the loss. You've just pushed God out of the picture. And we actually found it was as we pushed in towards God and went, okay, I'm pretty angry right now. And the Psalms give some vent to that, actually. I found the Psalms remarkably helpful because they give you a mandate for shouting at heaven sometimes and going, what is going on? That actually it made much more sense of what we're going through with God in the picture, because I think the most amazing thing about the God of the Bible, as opposed to the God we see in certain other religions, and I mentioned that book I wrote on the difference between the God in Christianity and Islam. The God of Islam is a God who's distant and remote and lives up there in heaven and suffering never touches him. The God of the Bible is a God who has walked the path of pain and suffering. We have a God who saw his son die on a cross. We have a God who, we're told has been, in Jesus has been tempted like us in every way, has been through every human experience and can identify with us. And I think having a God who can understand what we've been through and come alongside and give comfort and compassion is a huge beginning of an answer to that question. And then lastly, of course, I think although this is a little bit more in the theological rather than the practical, I still think to be helpful to regularly remind ourselves that we do not live in a world in which evil and suffering and loss is the last word. The last word is not the death of a 14-year-old. The last word is not a failed pregnancy. We know that in all things God does work through good, and we know that at the end the last word will be love and justice, that God will put right and every wrong thing will become undone. That is the great hope of the cross and the resurrection. And Christians have known for 2,000 years that we live between the resurrection of Jesus and the second coming. And so things are messy, but we do not grieve as people who don't have hope, as the New Testament reminds us. So yeah, grief and anger and frustration are natural. But the difference that Christians have is because of the resurrection. We know that is not the last word.
Okay, thanks, Andy. One of the many of the questions that we face really arise out of emotional issues, don't they? And people are not necessarily just using their mind; they're speaking from the heart. And our next question says that speaking to close family and friends about such important eternal outcomes is very emotional.
Yes.
I think we'd all agree with that. He says, what advice would you give about talking to folk when issues are so loaded emotionally, and thinking perhaps of elderly parents or those who are very ill?
Yeah, that's a really good question, isn't it? And a reminder, of course, that, we are, as human beings, we are both, we're thinkers, we are people with minds, but we're also people with emotions. And I think the first thing I would say in response to that is that, let's be careful as Christians talking to our friends and our neighbours and our colleagues. We don't just engage in the sort of philosophical, theological answers. We don't just quote Bible verses at people, but don't engage at the level of the heart as well as the level of the mind. And I think what made the ministry of, say, Jesus so effective is he was somebody who engaged both heart and mind. He addressed both those when the people that you're talking with, he was talking with. And I think we need to learn to do the same. So one way I find to do that can be helpful is, out of that first session I talked about, ask the power of good questions. When you're talking with someone who is obviously emotionally invested in the conversation, ask good questions to dig into that. If somebody is getting, upset or emotional in the conversation, rather than either ignore it or get emotional, oneself, and suddenly it can become an argument, to say to them, look, I can see that you're quite, this is quite a moving subject for you. Why is that? Why is this so moving to you? Why is this so important to you? What's going on? Bring those emotions out. Lean into them. And then on your own side as well, I think, talk about your Christian faith in emotional terms as well as mental terms. One of the reasons I'm so confident in my faith as a Christian, yes, is I believe absolutely in the historical life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. I know all the arguments for the existence of God. I can bore you stupid with those. But I'm also a Christian because following Jesus is deeply, richly, emotionally rewarding. There is a depth emotionally to the Christian faith in terms of lived experience of following Christ. Don't be afraid to talk about that. I think the power of the Christian faith is it addresses both mind and heart. If we just talk about the heart and not the mind, we have a problem. If we just talk about the mind and not the heart, we have a problem. Bring those two together and share the difference that Jesus has made for you.
Thank you. This next question, I think, probably goes back to what Andy was saying a little bit about freedom. It says, how can I answer my friends who say, why would I want to follow a God who won't let me be in a gay relationship if I am gay?
What an amazing question. There are some good questions coming out this morning, aren't there? Well, the first thing I'm going to say is, I'm going to offer a couple of thoughts on that, but that's a really big issue in our contemporary culture. So let me begin actually by recommending a really good resource that will help you go deeper into that. There's a wonderful Christian organization called Living Out, which is an organization run by a group of Christians who are same-sex attracted but living a biblically faithful lives. And some of the stories and testimonies there, because I think story and testimony is very powerful around this issue. And I would hugely recommend Living Out. One of my friends who's heavily involved in that is a guy called Ed Shaw, very well-known speaker on these issues. Ed is a pastor in Bristol, and Ed's book, The Plausibility Problem, is really worth a read. That looks at the whole question of why it is that same-sex issues have become so big and so massive, but then how as Christians we overcome those. And I think one of the things that Ed and others in that community that I know would say is, firstly, we need to step back from the immediate question, look at the big picture for a moment. And one of the questions we should be asking is, okay, what do we think the purpose of sex is? What do we actually think the purpose of sex is? You see, we live in a culture that tells us primarily sex is about pleasure, and it's about having as much of it as possible, and it's the greatest pleasure actually you might experience as a human being. And therefore, anything that restricts you, go back to freedom again, is restricting you from experiencing the greatest thing we can have as human beings, and of course how awful that would be. But as Christians, we might want to ask some questions about that narrative. first thing we want to say is really the whole purpose of human life sexual intimacy? It's certainly a good thing, but is it the greatest thing? Because if we are saying that, what are we saying to those who are single, or those who are widowed, or those who, for some reason, disability or something that prevents them having a sexual relationship? Are we therefore saying they are a poor, withered example of humanity who've missed out on what the whole human story is about? Because that's a very negative view of reality. Christianity, on the other hand, would say that sex is one of God's good gifts to us, but it's not the main thing. That the main thing we are designed for as human beings is relationship with God. And in fact, interestingly, when you read the Bible, what becomes interesting is that one of the main functions of sexuality is actually a pointer and a sign of what God's love for us is like. The number of times the Bible uses marriage and sexual intimacy as a metaphor for God's relationship with us. Think of that image in the New Testament of the church being the bride of Christ. So in one sense, if you are somebody who is same-sex attracted, and if you are, like Ed and others, following the Bible's teaching on marriage and sexuality, as Ed would put it, he said, okay, I don't get to, as it were, to perhaps enjoy the trailer for the movie, but I get to enjoy the movie, because the movie is relationship with Christ forever. The trailer is marriage and sexuality. So putting sex back at its place can be remarkably helpful is the first thing. But the second thing I think that's really important to say here, and this is where I think the church has sometimes gone wrong on sexuality issues, is we have been heard by our friends in the LGBTQIA+ community to be saying, unless you get your life sorted out sexually and live the way that we approve of, Jesus won't welcome you. Which has the cart entirely before the horse, because the model is that you come to Jesus with everything, all of your brokenness, all of your complexity, all of your chaos, and you lay it all down at Jesus' feet, and you say, you are Lord, I want to follow you, and then you let him begin dealing with you. And I would always say to people, it is not for me as a Christian to turn around to you as a gay person and say, you need to break up that relationship. I want to introduce you to Jesus, and then let the two of you take it from there. The church should be a radically inclusive community, where also then when people do become Christians, we walk alongside them as they walk through that journey of discipleship. Because sometimes when people become followers of Christ, it can take a while for Jesus and the Holy Spirit to deal with what's going on in their lives. And the more I think churches can show we are places where we are totally Jesus-centered, and we will support and encourage people as they seek to follow him and deal with the mess and brokenness that comes through the door, the more I think we can lance that boil a little bit. Yes, there'll still be tough questions about sexuality. There'll still be tough choices to make, but they come after somebody has chosen to follow Jesus, not before. And in fact, another of my friends, David Bennett, who's another same-sex attracted Christian following Christ, written a wonderful book called War of Loves. David has this nice line where he says evangelism is not homosexuality is not an evangelism issue, it's a discipleship issue. And we need to put it in that category, not in the former. So I hope some of that helps. And I'll put some, when I send the email around, I'll put some links to some resources on that, because it's a much bigger issue than I've really scratched the surface in that answer.
And it applies equally as well to somebody perhaps who's in a heterosexual relationship but not married perhaps.
Yeah, and I think on that very point, actually, Chris, I think also, linking to what I've just said, the more we can find ways of illustrating and showing that all of us as human beings have broken sexualities. Because sometimes we're heard by our gay friends to be sort of saying, well, heterosexuality is amazing and therefore you're automatically going to heaven, and homosexuality is a real mess. Going, actually, those of us who are heterosexual, our sexualities are broken because we're flawed human beings.
Okay. Right. Thank you very much for sending your questions to us. I've got one here which says, how do you persuade people to embrace the uncertainty that requires faith in an evidence-based world?
Oh gosh, there's a...
Do you want me to read it again?
No, that's a great,
right?
that's a wonderful question. Yeah, do you know, that's such a common question in some ways, isn't it? I remember having a recent conversation with a student for whom this is one of the big issues, I think, that they were looking for absolute certainty. And we live in this world where science is held up as the chief paradigm, and sometimes there's this sort of perception in culture that over here we have science, which is all based on evidence, and over here we have religion that is all based on faith, and given that sort of antithesis, obviously you'd want to choose science, right? Because it's amazing. And why would you choose faith? But I think one answer I like to sort of lean into as I'm beginning to address people thinking around this is, of course, first thing is let's get faith understood correctly. Faith is not believing something without evidence. If people have that in their head, that faith is what you have when you don't have evidence, of course people are going to have a problem. For asking them to take a leap of blind faith, no wonder they'll look at you a bit askance. But thankfully the Bible doesn't ask us to use blind faith. The Bible says faith is a gift, but it's not the gift of stupidity. Faith is making a commitment based on the evidence, even though the evidence may only get you so far, but the faith takes you the rest of the way. And a good analogy, actually, I found over the years here is marriage, actually. So I mentioned my wonderful wife earlier. So when I asked Astrid to marry me on the 30th of August, 1997, see, I don't just know the date we met and our wedding anniversary, I know the date I proposed. It's been beaten into me over the years. At that point, I knew lots of things about my wife, my girlfriend at that point. I knew what she liked. I knew the kind of movies she enjoyed watching. I knew the kind of jokes she appreciated, not the ones I told, sadly enough, but no one's perfect. I knew lots of things about her. I knew lots of facts. But the moment I asked her to marry me, I was moving from beliefs about her to belief in her. I was actually asking her to put her trust in me, and I was putting my trust in her. Now, I've got lots of facts about my wife. I have lots of confidence in her, but I don't have 100% certainty. I think she's faithful. I believe that. But I can't be 100% sure. She might be having a wild affair with the next door neighbour as we speak. He's in his 70s and has a wooden leg, but you never know. And I think so it goes for religious faith. I would say to people, there is lots of evidence about the Christian faith we might talk about. Lots of evidence for the life of Jesus and the resurrection, all kinds of other things. And those are great things to talk about, and there are books you can read and things you can think about. But there will come a point where you have to, on the basis of that evidence, go, am I now going to place my trust? Am I now going to take that step forward and actually make this personal and something I'm standing on rather than just something I'm thinking about? But helping our friends go, that is not a leap of faith. It is the natural sort of step that we make in other contexts too. But you may, depending on the person you're talking with, you may want to start by talking about some evidence and go, well, let's think about the things that might give us some confidence that we're not being totally bonkers, that actually there is something to Christianity. But at the same time, be willing to challenge somebody and go, okay, you've done the reading, you've done the thinking. At what point are you now going to be willing to take that step? Because 100% certainty doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in any sphere of life. All of you guys could be an illusion. I could be a brain in a jar plugged in, having a mad scientist manipulating my neurons to make me think you are all here. But I don't think that's likely, but I can't disprove it totally.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much for your questions. If you think of something later on, feel free to send the text to me, and we'll collate them and send them on to Andy. And I'm sure if you put some, we'll have your number so he can perhaps respond to them, or we'll try and compile them together so he can send a group response out. I think we've got time for just one more question. If there's anything from you, if anybody wants to put their hand up and be brave enough.
Oh,
there we go.
Gentleman there, fantastic. What's your name, sir?
My name's Keith.
Keith.
Question referring to one of your books there. What would be your response to a Muslim who is adamant that we do both worship the same God?
Brilliant question, Keith. Thank you. I'm very tempted to cheekily say, well, if you get the book, that'll answer the question. But the funny thing is, by way of context, when I first wrote that book a couple of years ago, it came out. When it was announced on kind of social media, I had two groups of people having lots of people were quite positive. I had two groups of people having a go at me. I had one group of people attacking me on social media saying, how can you even ask the question? It's obvious it's the same God. And then another group of people are attacking me saying, well, how can you even ask the question? It's obvious the answer is no. And I was like, well, the fact you guys are both adamant about your yes or your no tells me why It was a book needed. The interesting thing is you'll meet Muslims, Keith, who are in both those camps. So I have Muslim friends who would say, well, obviously, Allah is the same as the God of the Bible. Muhammad was a prophet in the same line as all the other prophets. It's the same message. In fact, they would go further and say Jesus and all those biblical figures were in fact Muslims. I've met other Muslims who would say, well, clearly it's a different God because you Christians believe in three gods. 1 + 1 + 1 is 3, right? And we Muslims, Allahu Akbar, worship one God. So it's clearly you guys are polytheists and you need to return to the one true faith. So it's interesting that the Muslim community is divided. So Muslims who are in that camp of saying it's all the same, the way I begin responding, Keith, and in fact, one of the reasons I wrote the book was I began to realize when I was talking to Muslims about Jesus, and they were struggling with the idea of Jesus being God, which is one of the common questions Muslims have for Christians. The struggle with it was they had the wrong understanding of God. If you take the understanding of God in the Quran and try and fit Jesus into it, it makes no sense. And so I was beginning to have more conversations with Muslims around what God is like. And so with a Muslim who says that, I'd begin by saying, okay, well, let's talk about God for a moment. Tell me about the God in the Quran, Allah. What is he like? What do you believe about God? And ask questions, let them feel they've had the time to answer that. And then as a Christian, what I'd say is, look, you see, when I turn to the Bible, some of the chief attributes of God in the Bible that I see there, all over the Bible, is that God is a God who is relational. In the first pages of Genesis, he's walking and talking in the garden with Adam and Eve. He's walking and talking with Moses. In fact, Exodus tells us God spoke to Moses as a man speaks with his friend. He dwells with his people in the wilderness, pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. He shows up regularly, and then, of course, he steps into history in the person of Jesus, and in the new heavens and the new earth, we'll be walking and talking with God again. He's a relational God. He's a God who could be known. Time and time again, the Bible tells us not just to know about God, but to know him. Think of that famous passage in Jeremiah where it says, let not the wise boast in their wisdom or the strong boast in their strength, but the one who boasts in this, that they understand and know me. The idea of knowing God, all there across the Bible. The God of the Bible is a God who is love. We don't need to unpack that one in detail. They're on every page of the Bible. And the God of the Bible is a God who has suffered in Christ and through the cross to win us back to him. And then I would say to my Muslim friend, now what's interesting, we turn over to the Quran, and the Quran either denies or ignores those categories. In fact, it will often take biblical stories and retell them in such a way as to remove those elements. So Adam and Eve, the creation story is there in the Quran. God doesn't walk and talk with them. The paradise is there in the Quran, but paradise is a place of rivers of wine, crystal clear fountains of water, virgins for the men to enjoy. No God, he's absent. And the more those differences stack up, then you have to begin wondering, are we actually talking about the same God? Now, what's interesting, when I've done that, sometimes I'll have Muslim friends push back and say, particularly of the love one, well, I believe in a God who's a God of love. And then I'll say to my Muslim friend, okay, well, just out of interest, can you show me where in the Quran you're getting that from? Because it's not there. But then I would say, look, I totally agree with you that God is a God of love. But the fact that you're drawn to that shows me that the God you are seeking for is actually the God of the Bible, not the God of the Quran. Come on home, because Jesus died for Muslims too. Don't mishear me on that. I'm not saying that's therefore Islam is therefore a route of salvation. It's that God died for our Muslim friends, our atheist friends, our Hindu friends, all of our friends Jesus died for. And what we want to do is show them that the God that they're looking for is there in Jesus. And in fact, a dear friend of mine died a few years ago now as a former Muslim called Nabil Qureshi. And some of you may have, a few people nodding, maybe heard that name. Nabil wrote a brilliant testimony, the story of his journey from Islam to Christianity. And I love the title, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. He wanted to know God more deeply. And as he pursued that quest, he found it was Jesus at the end of it. So that's kind of how I would begin to address it, Keith. Start questions, find out what they believe, and then talk about how our view of God is actually quite different.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for your coming along this morning and for your questions and your interest. Perhaps you could just show your appreciation for Andy now.
Thank you.
You've learned this morning, meditate on what you've written down, pray that God would help you to put it into practice. If you would like to support just our personal church putting on this event financially, then you can give by the box which is on the back stand. If you're not able to, that's fine. It is put on for free to the glory of God and to build us up as Christians. And to that end, we're going to close with a song. So I'm going to invite you to stand and sing "Tell Out My Soul." Tell out my soul. Tell out my soul the greatness of the Lord.